All right, guys, let's hit histology now. I love this section. I didn't used to like it as a student, to be honest, but now I really, really love it, especially after we've been through all of these old tests. I feel like I have a really good feel for the items they've nailed on past tests, so hang with me. I'm going to walk you through it. Obviously, it's not one of the big 5 sections, but it is still a lot of questions. 23 questions is a lot, and it bleeds into a lot of the major areas from the big 5. So I'm going to show you the tie-ins on how it ties into the big 5 to make sure that we're just rock solid for your test, okay? So let's dive in together, get excited. Let's dominate this section together, okay? Let's look into the notes right now. So as you can see, plasma membrane is what is described first. You guys probably remember what it says there in your notes about the fluid mosaic model, that it's this structure of lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates. What I want to hone in on is the lipids. You can see there's 3 lipids there, but pay attention to cholesterol, okay? You might remember that cholesterol, as it says here in the notes, is found only in eukaryotic cells. If you get that confused, remember you are a eukaryote, okay? I mean, I know it's kind of silly, but say it to yourself. You are a eukaryote, okay? You're going to see later on in the notes, we're going to talk about prokaryotes later on, and we'll get into that in more detail. It'll be the highlight of your day. But what I want to point out here is the cholesterol values. You can see them, they're listed right here for you. Do you remember which one's considered good cholesterol? HDL, yes. Think of HDL as healthy cholesterol, LDL as lousy cholesterol, right? What I want you to pay attention to here is the generalities about the norms, okay? I don't know that they're going to ask you the exact number of 130 or 50, but I would definitely know the generalities of it. For example, have you ever heard of the rule of 50s before? What that is, and I'll show you a visual of it here, is you want to think of HDL is around 50, okay? And again, I know the notes are a little different on this. It depends on the source. But think of HDL, say to yourself, higher than 50. When it gets to LDL, okay, you want to think less than around 100, okay? Everything's going to go in 50 increments, okay? So higher than 50, less than 100. What is 3 times 50, that's 150. So think triglycerides is around 150 and total cholesterol is going to be 200, okay? So that'll give you kind of a ballpark idea to think about this and help you get through that. The big thing in this paragraph though is what HDL does. You all know it's healthy cholesterol, but why? Hone in on this. Look in the paragraph. It says it takes excess cholesterol from organs back to where? Back to the liver. Okay, that's something you want to hone in on. It takes it back to the liver. LDL is going to do the opposite, take it from the liver to the external tissues, okay? So hone in on that. That's why it's healthy. That's a good test question and something we've seen stressed on old tests, okay? That's a big deal. As you go down in your notes, this is a moment in the notes where it's not very important. You can kind of pause the video and just skim the next half page and come back with me after that, okay? The next important section I want to hit is the nucleus, okay? This is basic stuff, but you definitely want to hone in on this. Do you remember what transcription and what replication are, okay? Well, we're going to talk about it in a second, but remember that it happens in the nucleus, transcription and replication. What about translation, if they ask you on the test? Where does translation happen? The answer is going to be in the cytoplasm, okay? So hone in on that quickly. All right, guys, look at the heading number of nuclei. This is something you could easily want to skim. Don't. This is golden. Hone in on this because it says osteoclast and skeletal muscle cells can be multinuclear. They've asked that verbatim, which 2 are multinuclear. So highlight that. And if they wanted to take that to another level, check out this visual on the screen. Make sure you write this down. They can oftentimes not only be multinuclear, but they could ask you where the nuclei is located, and it's peripheral in location. So hone in on that. The next line talks about how there's one type of cell that's anuclear. That's going to be red blood cells. Check out this visual so you can remember the biconcave structure of a red blood cell, okay? That's important to know. Now as we get into the next heading, which is contents of the nucleus, this is another kind of pause and skim moment. Just take a look at this for a second. It has not been hit high on old tests. Now guys, look at the heading that says transcription and translation. You guys might remember transcription is going to be DNA to mRNA, translation, mRNA to protein. Hey, by the way, where does translation happen again? Cytoplasm, yes. Transcription, nucleus, good, okay? So the next heading, guys, that we're going to hit is going to be on organelles, okay? And this has been really hammered in the past, a really hot spot in the notes hone in on this with me. In particular, you're going to see ribosomes have been hit really hard in mitochondria. So don't fall asleep right now. This is big. All right, so the first thing I want to look at is, if I asked you guys, what's the function of a ribosome, you would say, what? Protein synthesis. Yes, it makes proteins, right? And you're going to see that there are drugs that we can prescribe that bind to ribosomes, right, and stop protein synthesis. And so take a look at this visual for a second. I'm going to dive into micro, which you're going to get later on, just briefly. Okay, the mnemonic we like to use is you want to buy low, right, and sell high. So this mnemonic is from the USMLE textbook. I've used it for years. I love it. So think of it like you want to buy at 30 and you want to sell, CEL, for 50, right? The at 30 is aminoglycosides, tetracyclines. The sell at 50 is chloramphenicol, erythromycin, lincomycin. Bottom line is, at 30, sell 50. The take-home message of the big picture on that is both of those, whether it's the at 30 or sell at 50, is going to mess up protein synthesis because you're screwing with a ribosome, right? Okay, so that's a little quick micro review. Know that that's been hit a lot on old test. Look at the heading that says found within the cell in two forms. So we're looking at ribosomes found within the cell in two forms, free floating or bound. The bound one is the one I want you to pay attention to because it says ribosomes can be bound to ER, right? And that's what's going to be used to move proteins out of the cell. All right, so look at this visual with me for a minute. When you're thinking about protein synthesis, you either want to think proteins used for the cell or to be exported out of the cell. The exported out of the cell makes for great board questions. And the way you want to think about this is the ribosome works in conjunction with the rough ER, and the rough ER then works in conjunction with the Golgi, right? And when the protein pinches off the Golgi, now it's called a lysosome. So put that together in your mind, okay? Because I'm going to show you in a second, that has been asked over and over on old test questions. The idea that when you're pushing a protein out of the cell, you want to know that kind of schematic of rough ER, Golgi, lysosome, okay? So take a look at this visual right now to show you some of the ways they've asked this on old tests. Another organelle, guys, that's been hit really hard is smooth ER. Okay, so bottom line is on smooth ER, it can vary depending on where it's located at in the body. For example, the first dash says adrenal cortex. So in the adrenal cortex, it's used to make steroids. Whereas in liver cells, right, it's used to detoxify, don't miss this, detoxify lipid-soluble drugs. Okay, that's been hammered a lot in the past, smooth ER. The other thing you've heard a lot is sarcoplasmic reticulum. You know that sequesters calcium in muscle cells. That's modified smooth ER. Okay, so they've asked smooth ER in a number of different ways. They're all listed here, so hone in on that. Okay, so here's some review here in your notes on rough ER and Golgi. You can see rough ER, third bullet point, is always involved in the production of proteins that will be exported out of the cell. The key message I wanted you to get from that diagram is rough ER pumps out kind of generic proteins, right? Just generic proteins, whereas Golgi makes them golden. Think of it that way. It makes them specialized, right? And so pay attention to that variance in terms of how they can nitpick one from the other. Lysosomes, like you saw in the visual, anytime you're making a ton of proteins, right, you're going to be pinching off a ton of lysosomes. So pay attention to that type of question too. If you're making excess proteins, you're going to have a ton of which organelle. It's going to be lysosomes, okay? That's what you want to pay attention to when you're looking at lysosomes. All right, guys, let's talk about the mitochondria. You guys know the fact that it's a powerhouse of the cell. Every one of you would get that right. The picky question they've been asking is to know, does it have a lipid bilayer? I mean, come on, I mean, isn't that picky? But what they want you to know is yes, it not only has a lipid bilayer, but look in the first bullet point, it has a double lipid bilayer. That's been something they've been hitting. The other thing I would pay attention to is in the third bullet point, it's passed on by mothers. See the word maternal there? Circle that. That's going to be the organelle that's passed on by moms, okay? The next thing, look in your notes, guys, is cytoskeleton. I want you to pay attention to microfilaments and microvilli. Okay, say this to yourself. Microfilaments fill microvilli. Because the question has been, what is the core of microvilli? And the answer is microfilaments. Microfilaments fill microvilli. If I asked you guys, what's the purpose of microvilli? You might say things like increasing absorption, diffusion. That's great. They want you to know on the test it increases surface area, okay? And that's pretty obvious to you. You guys know that's why it's located in the kidneys, for example, okay? For microtubules, I want you to circle the T in the middle of the word. Microtubules, and I want you to think motility, okay? Motility is kind of the key phrase you want to have in your mind about microtubules. All right, guys, the next thing we want to talk about is cell junctions, and this has been hit multiple times on old tests. Let me point out what you should know. Okay, the first thing is gap junctions, and you guys know that allows rapid communication, but for what type of cells? Do you remember? What's going to need rapid connection? Well, nervous tissue would, cardiac tissue, heart tissue, obviously, okay? So hone in on that. Tight junctions, remember, is the same thing as zonula occludens junction. Same thing. Now let me show you this visual to kind of walk you through zonula occludens and macular adherens in hemidesmosomes, okay? Because they could ask, and they have asked this in this form and fashion in the past, okay? So when you think about this visual, you see that there's an epidermis, there's a basement membrane, and there's a dermis, okay? Epidermis, basement membrane, and a dermis. And the epidermis, that's going to be obviously the surface, okay? We want zonula occludens or tight junctions right in this location right here, okay? And the purpose of that is to limit the movement of substances between cells, okay? So if you stop the movement of stuff between those cells, you know what it does? It forces those substances to go through the cell themselves, right? So the cell can control what gets in and what gets out. That's the key point, right? Is that it does not allow substances to go between cells. That's what's been hit on old tests, okay? It's going to be on the surface of things, okay? Zonula occludens is. When you think of adherens junctions, look at that second bullet point. It says tonofilaments and a mucoprotein substance. That is freaking picky, right? Pay attention to that. If you look at zonula adherens, again, it's going to be a belt-like junction, right? But the purpose of it is going to be to support cells between one another, okay? So this is where it would be located on this diagram. You see it? Good, okay. Now the next one is macular adherens. And I want you to think of macular adherens as the same thing as a desmosome, because they could easily ask you about this idea of spot weld, which let's take a look at that right here on the diagram, okay? You see that? You could easily get a question that just says, is it macular occludens or something like that? You want to think MAD, like you're mad. Macular adherens is the same thing as a desmosome, okay? Connect that in your mind. That's a spot weld in that location. Last but not least is my favorite, guys, which is hemidesmosome. When you think about hemidesmosome, you want to think it's always going to connect basement membrane to something else. Always basement membrane to something else. I love getting those questions on standardized tests. Anything about a hemidesmosome, I'm looking for two words. Basement membrane, okay? So hone in on that when you see that on the test. All right, guys, let's look at the heading of tissue types. All right, now when you think of histology in general, it is the study of tissues, okay? So now we're getting into pure histology. We've already dominated the cell. So as we get into tissue types, we're gonna start with epithelium. When you think of epithelium, you wanna think there's simple epithelium, and this is how the next couple pages are going to be organized. Simple epithelium, stratified epithelium, and secretory epithelium. The secretory is where the magic's going to be at in terms of test questions, because secretory epithelium, an example of that is endocrine and exocrine glands. So you want to hone in on that portion of the notes, but don't turn me off yet or push that 15-second button, because you're going to want to know some of this stuff right now, okay? So let's look at the bottom of the page and talk through this together. You can see with epithelium, epithelium is a vascular tissue. Circle that. Next line, it's associated with underlying vascular tissue, and it says a function accomplished by basement membranes. Now, when you read that sentence, make sure you understand the basement membrane doesn't have blood vessels either, okay? The basement membrane is transferring oxygen from the blood vessels in the dermis, the underlying dermis, okay? So that's a key thing to know, is that the epithelium does not have blood vessels, either does the basement membrane. All right, guys, now let's look at a pretty simple page, which is epithelium. So there's simple and stratified epithelium. When you think of simple epithelium, we have a mnemonic there called SAD, S-A-D. That's the function. So you got secretion, absorption, diffusion. I know you can read that on your page. To help you remember the functions, think of like secretion right there. Think of it like right there, it says cuboidal. Think of like a Rubik's Cube. Okay, a Rubik's Cube is hard to figure out. So think of that as it's a secret if you want. So when you see cuboidal on the test, think secretion, okay? Pay attention to that. You're going to see later on as we get into the thyroid. Do you know what cells within the thyroid, okay, produce T3 and T4? Just quiz you real fast. Well, if you don't worry about it. We'll get to it later. But that's follicular cells. So if they ask you on boards, follicular cells are obviously going to be cuboidal because they're secreting things, okay? That's a way they could connect items on the test. But one thing I want you to pay attention to underneath simple epithelium is that dash that says pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pay attention to that. First of all, look at the word pseudostratified columnar. What do we say columnar does again? Columnar is going to be absorption, okay? So it makes sense as you read on the respiratory tract, we want absorption there, okay? So pay attention to that. That's been asked on old tests, pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The rest of this, the stratified epithelium, I would pause and just skim. There's been very little to nothing asked on old tests there, but I would just kind of glance at the examples just for a second. The other item I want you to pay attention to is transitional epithelium. If they asked you right now, where is transitional epithelium located, what would you think? It'd be the bladder, okay? So the big thing is in the bladder, you want the ability to stretch when pressure is applied, right? So know that, no transitional epithelium is in the bladder. And the hard question they've asked on old test is right here. So take a look at this visual. All right, guys, now we can get into the fun stuff, which is exocrine glands and endocrine glands. Now tell me that doesn't sound fun to you, right? So first off with exocrine glands, you want to know, as it says here in the first dash, the number of cells in the gland, unicellular versus multicellular, the shape of the duct, but most importantly, the way the product leaves the duct. See secretion right there? That's what you should pay attention to. If you scroll down, you can see in your notes there's holocrine, apocrine, merocrine, right? I want to show you through this visual kind of how they differ, all right? When you say holocrine, look at this visual right here. You can see holocrine, the whole cell is shed. Say it to yourself. Holocrine, whole cell is shed. When you say apocrine, say a piece, apocrine, a piece of the cell, and make sure you know that it's membrane bound. It says that in your notes. Hone in on that for a second. A piece is broken off and it's membrane bound. Last but not least, merocrine, most common. Say that to yourself. Merocrine, most common, and it's going to be the only one that does exocytosis, which has been hit on old tests. So hone in on that as well. Okay. Now you're going to see, guys, as it says in the notes here, the pancreas is unique in that it contains endocrine and exocrine units. We're going to get into that later on. But as you turn the page, you're going to see insulin and glucagon. Do you remember that? I want you to say it this way. When you say insulin, say bensulin. Okay, it sounds kind of stupid, I know. But when you say insulin, say bensulin, because beta cells do insulin. When you say glucagon, you got to turn Italian. You got to say like glucagone, glucagone, right? Because that'll help you remember glucagon is secreted by alpha cells. Okay, dumb stuff, right? But you all know, you've heard of this for years. Sometimes it's just easy to mix that stuff up. So pay attention to that on the test. All right, guys, now let's look at endocrine glands. I want you to circle that D of endocrine, and I want you to say ductless. Ductless. This does not have any ducts. Second sentence, second bullet point says, left without a duct, the nearby connective tissue forms a net of blood vessels. And so these fluids are going to be secreted into the extracellular tissue and absorbed, okay? Now, the reason this makes for such a good question is because as we get into the ductless glands, we're going to talk a lot about the thyroid, the adrenal, the pituitary glands. So hone in on this. This has been hit hard, and you're going to see a lot of awesome connections in this stuff. I love this stuff. Huge in terms of your patients in the future. So let's make sure we know this, not just to pass the test, but to obviously be awesome doctors. So let's look at this together. So first of all, thyroid gland. You want to know where is it located, okay? It says right there in your notes, obviously anterior to the trachea. Okay, you know it's butterfly shape. My question to you is, who bosses around the thyroid gland? Who's the boss of the thyroid gland? Look at this visual here. This is cool. So you want to know that the thyroid gland is bossed around by the anterior pituitary. Do you remember what the anterior pituitary releases to tell the thyroid gland what to do? Yes, TSH. Hey, by the way, is that TSH made in the anterior pituitary or the posterior pituitary? Yes, anterior pituitary. Good. Now, another question. Keep looking at this visual. What is going to tell the anterior pituitary what to do? The answer is the hypothalamus, okay? That would be a kind of a good chain. You want to pay attention to this chain of how things work in terms of telling the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. Do you guys remember what I mentioned earlier about what cells in the thyroid produce T3 and T4? Follicular cells, yes. They're going to be cuboidal. You remember that? Because that's secretory epithelium. Yes, good, guys, we're getting it. You can do this. We can dominate every single section on this, okay? I want to get every one of these questions right. Let's go down to the next one, which is parafollicular cells. You can see in the first dash, it's located between the follicles, okay? And this has a different function, which is to produce calcitonin. If I asked most of you guys, what does the thyroid gland do? Everyone would say T3 and T4. Very few students remember calcitonin. So pay attention to that. That's really, really important. But my favorite part on this page is the next dash, which is signs of hyperthyroidism. Now pause for a second. Let me guide you for a minute, okay? If you see hyperthyroidism on the test, First thing you want to know is it's an autoimmune disease, right? Now, if I asked you what happens in hyperthyroidism, you would want to know it's an autoimmune disease that produces what? What is fooling the thyroid? Well, it's a TSH autoantibody, okay? Hang with me, that sounds kind of dorky, but it's a molecule that looks and feels and acts just like TSH. So this molecule comes and attaches and keeps binding to the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland just keeps pumping out T3 and T4 over and over again. So you know if they ask you on boards, patients with hyperthyroidism are going to have really high T3 and T4 levels, but those high T3 and T4 levels are going to create negative feedback and you're going to have a low TSH. Okay, make sure you pay attention to that. But my favorite part of this page is looking at the different signs of hyperthyroidism, because I think this is a no-brainer on boards. Make sure you know, for example, as you look at this paragraph with me, that the bottom line is when you think hyperthyroidism is think increased sympathetic. Make sure you have that down in your head. Increased sympathetic. If you have more sympathetic, you're going to have, for example, weight gain or weight loss. You're going to have weight loss, right? Are you going to have an increase in heart rate or a decrease in heart rate? Obviously an increase in heart rate. Are you going to be intolerant to heat or cold? Well, if your blood pressure is up and everything's going crazy like this, you're going to be intolerant to heat, okay? That's how you want to think of hyperthyroidism. Think of it like sympathetic type effects, okay? That's what I would hone in on. The last thing I want to hit on this page is calcitonin. Just one quick reminder, circle that IN at the end of calcitonin and think calcitonin inhibits osteoclast. We'll come back to that later on. Just circle that IN to help you remember inhibits for later on, okay? The next thing we want to talk about is the parathyroid gland. You guys know it's located on the back of the thyroid. I would definitely know that it produces PTH, okay? And this is going to be kind of calcitonin's enemy. They hate each other, okay? PTH wants to increase blood calcium, whereas, what did we say? Calcitonin wants to inhibit osteoclast to decrease blood calcium, okay? So think PTH and calcitonin are enemies, all right? The next thing I want to look at is the adrenal gland. And you guys remember that the adrenal gland has a medulla and has a cortex. This is hot. This is big, okay? This has been asked a lot on old tests. You want to dominate the medulla versus the cortex. So if I asked you what's in the adrenal medulla, you're going to say epinephrine and norepinephrine. You're all over that. Now, let me just stretch you on that for a minute and ask you, do you remember the name of a tumor? And by the way, you'll see this in the pathology section, systemic disease portion of our textbook. Do you remember the name of a tumor that causes excessive release of epinephrine and norepinephrine? That disease is going to be pheochromocytoma. Good, okay? Pay attention to that. You can make a note in your margin if you want, but you're going to see that in that section, all right? Now, when you think about the cortex, this is where the money test question should come from, okay? So look at this visual with me. You're going to see that there's 3 zones, and the way we remember this is the mnemonic go, fast, Reggie. Go, fast, Reggie. And as it says here in your notes, that's outer to inner. So in our visual, you can see outer to inner, go, fast, Reggie. And then you need to say salt, sugar, sex, okay? So that kind of reminds you what each zone does. For example, if I had to identify the most likely test question out of there, I would say the fast, the fasciculata. What is it again? Go, fast, Reggie, salt, sugar. There it is, sugar. So fasciculata does sugar. So in other words, it causes the release of cortisol, right? So you know anytime you see cortisol, steroids, that should be a hot item on the test. So pay attention to steroids. We'll cover that later on as well. But you want to know what region of the adrenal cortex releases steroids. That's the fasciculata. Hey, by the way, who tells the adrenal cortex to release that steroids? Who tells it to do that? That's going to be ACTH, right? Good. Speaking of, let's get into that now as we get into the pituitary gland. So look at your notes with me for a second. At the first line, it says located within the sella turcica. You guys know, you've seen the Latin term for this. This is also called like a saddle. It's in the body of the sphenoid bone, okay? So literally it's a depression in that bone. And you guys know that right above the pituitary gland is going to be what? It's going to be the optic chiasm, yes, where the nasal fibers from the optic nerve crosses, okay? So if they say something like a patient has a pituitary gland tumor, you're going to think they're going to have a loss of peripheral vision in both eyes. It's called a bitemporal hemianopsia, okay? So if you don't remember that, just make a note of that. But that's something you want to know about the pituitary gland. But right now, in terms of histology, what we want to pay attention to, as it says here in the notes, that there's an anterior pituitary. Let's look at that. It says it's formed from the roof of the mouth, Rathke's pouch. The next line says that it has the pars distalis, okay? So think of distalis like distended. It's really big, okay? So if they ask you which portion of the pituitary gland is the biggest, it's this one, as opposed to, you're going to see on the next page, the pars nervosa is part of the posterior pituitary. So right now I just want you to say pars distalis, distended, huge. That's the big portion of the pituitary gland that they have asked on old tests. Okay, so what I want to do here for you now is check out this visual for a second, because I think really hard questions on the anterior pituitary will come from looking at this visual. Okay, so you're going to see here in the visual you have basophils and acidophils, right? Basophils, the way to think of it, think basophils, think base and think flat, like you have a flat base. And that'll remind you, FLAT, what four hormones are produced by basophils. Okay. Now look also at acidophils. You want to think pig, like PIG. So if you want to think of like a pig that's on acid or something, I don't know, whatever helps you remember it. But you want to think right there, prolactin, growth hormone are produced by acidophils. Okay. Now if you look at growth hormone for a second, look at this visual with me. Do you guys remember, if you have excessive growth hormone in kids, what disease does that? Gigantism, yes. What about in adults? You want to think acromegaly, yes. Circle that A of acromegaly and think adults. Okay, so if you want to pause and like write that visual down and really solidify that, remember you want to think flat base, and you want to think acid and pig go together. Okay, take a look at that visual. That could be really good test questions. In particular, hone in on that ACTH. All right, that's big because it's all about steroids, baby. You'll hear me say that over and over. It's all about steroids. You got to know the steroids. Okay. All right, guys, let's look at posterior pituitary. Let's look at the notes together. First bullet point says it originates from the floor of the diencephalon, blah, 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 who cares, and remains attached to the hypothalamus. Pay attention to that. You heard me say earlier the posterior pituitary does not produce, which is the next bullet point, it does not produce any hormones, right? But they could get picky and want you to know where are the hormones coming from. And right there it says, but remains attached to the hypothalamus. Put an arrow to your right and say, where ADH and oxytocin are produced, right? So the hypothalamus produces those hormones and then they're transferred to the posterior pituitary for release, okay? That's the big thing you want to pay attention to. Now, if you scroll down in your notes, you'll see ADH, oxytocin. Hey guys, do you remember the difference between ADH and oxytocin? Well, ADH, you're going to know in the kidneys, is used at the collecting duct to increase water absorption. So ADH will increase blood pressure. So as you see that later on in your notes in general physiology, make sure you know that ADH increases blood pressure. By the way, this is kind of a quick aside, so look at this visual. You're going to see the triple A's, as we call them, increase blood pressure. ADH, aldosterone, angiotensin. Pay attention to those. Triple A, increase blood pressure. All right? Now, if you look at oxytocin, you guys know oxytocin helps to do something with milk, right? And oxytocin is going to help with milk ejection, whereas prolactin is milk production, all right? Subtle difference there. Say to yourself, prolactin production, okay? These are the key points I wanted you to get from the pituitary glands and the endocrine glands. You'll nail that section. We hit that really thoroughly, so just let's keep the momentum going, all right?